One Friday evening, my dad picked me up for our weekend visits. Turning onto our street, we saw multiple fire trucks and ambulances parked outside one of the houses 2 doors down from ours. Lights were flashing, and there were people moving quickly in all directions. Being 12 at the time, looking back, I don't believe my dad wanted me to know what had happened. It would be a few months before I learned what had taken place. A mother and her son had come home from an afternoon of shopping. The young boy was the first into the house, excited to show his dad what they had bought, only to find his father's feet dangling. He had hung himself, and his body hung through the attic entrance directly in front of the main door. With his childhood ripped from under him, the traumatized young boy and his mother moved immediately. Seriously, to anyone contemplating suicide, please get help. Months passed and a new family moved in. It was a man named Paul and his 2 young twin daughters. Our neighbourhood was very tight-knit. Our new neighbours quickly became close friends, and after a little while, Paul began commenting on happenings around the house. It would range from taps and footsteps, random handprints forming on the wall, to a full-on apparition of a man. This is when I learned about what happened with our previous neighbour. I didn't know anyone had died, and neither did Paul before moving into the house. One evening the adults wanted to have a couple of beers, so I offered to bring over my GameCube to Paul's and have a slumber party with his kids and the other neighbourhood kids. I was 13 and they were 5 and 9. I was fully aware of the potential haunting, and I jumped on this opportunity to perhaps experience something paranormal. I was strictly instructed by my dad to not mention any ghosts or ask about occurrences as to not scare the young twins who lived there. So we sat on the couch in the living room playing Animal Crossing. All 5 kids and myself. There was absolutely no one else home and everyone was next to me. I should note that this house was a cookie-cutter version of mine, just the opposite way round. I knew where all the entrances were, and the bathroom was directly to the right of us. As we played, the faucet in the bathroom began to run. My skin crawled, and I wasn't sure if the kids had realised the faucet had turned on. Not sure of what to do, I kept playing, and after about 30 seconds, one of the girls looks at me and asks, "Is someone else in the house with us?" "No," I replied. She was confused and commented that the faucet had turned on in the bathroom. I just looked at her and said, "Yep." Respecting my dad's orders of not scaring the kids, I kept my mouth shut and didn't comment on anything else. The faucet turned off and eventually we all went to sleep. Later that night at around 2 or 3 a.m, I woke up to feeling some pressure. This particular feeling I would eventually become familiar with, as it would start to happen whenever I was in a cemetery or even when someone had walked into a room, and without hearing them I could feel their presence. It's the same pressure as when you hold your hand 3 inches from your ear and all the noise is muffled. In the pitch-dark room I couldn't move. The kids were all sleeping around me, so I didn't want to overreact and scare them. I laid there absolutely terrified, and this is when I heard the parakeets on top of the fridge in the next room, as well as the dog in the laundry room, begin to go crazy. Flapping, squawking and barking caused my blood to run cold. Then with a loud thud on the ceiling right above my head, everything went silent. Looking back, above where I was laying is where the attic entrance was. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the moment the sun rose I grabbed my games and ran home. My dad sat outside and was surprised I was home so early. I told him of the happenings and he chuckled, exclaiming, "Ghosts aren't real, child." About 4 years ago, I went on a vacation with my family to Europe. We stayed in England for a couple of days during our trip. Whilst there, one of the nights we stayed at this old bed and breakfast in a very old, quiet cobblestone town. The bed and breakfast was so old and creaky and had been virtually untouched since the 1800s, with all the original fixtures, etc. I stayed in a room on the 2nd floor with my sister, Kristen. There were twin beds, and I slept on the bed in the far end of the room right next to the closet that was at the foot of my bed. While we were getting settled in, I was going on about how old and eerie the building was. I distinctly remembered looking at the closet, which was partially open, and saying to my sister, "Well, that's creepy. This is staying closed," and closing it. closet gave me a weird vibe. Now this is when shit gets weird. I have always had sleep paralysis. It's not uncommon for me to get it, and I've only had 2 experiences out of many where I've felt a presence. This is one of those experiences. So it's late at night, probably around midnight, and my sister had already fallen asleep. I was up reading a book when suddenly I became extremely tired out of nowhere. This is strange because it typically takes me a really long time to fall asleep. I turned the lamp off and fell straight to sleep. Next thing I know, I can feel a weight at the foot of my bed, near the closet, as if someone had sat down on my bed. I figured it was my sister and I opened my eyes. I then saw my sister still laying in the bed next to me fast asleep. This is when I realized I was having sleep paralysis. I couldn't move or speak. I looked at the foot of my bed where I could still feel a weight on me. There was a young girl in all white staring at me. I got extremely scared and started trying to yell for my sister. Since I had sleep paralysis, I couldn't say her name, so I closed my eyes and tried to will myself awake. Once I was finally able to move, I turned the lamp on and the girl had vanished. I woke up my sister immediately to tell her what had happened. She was half asleep, annoyed, and didn't believe me. She told me to go back to sleep, so I did, with the covers over my head. In the morning, my mum came in early to wake us up for breakfast. We both got up and started to get dressed, and that's when I noticed the closet was open, like wide open. The door wasn't loose, and even if I hadn't latched it, which I know I did, it still wasn't light enough to swing open. I asked my sister if she had opened the closet door in the middle of the night, as I checked that it was closed before I lay down and started to read. She said no, that she hadn't got up at all last night. She still doesn't believe what I experienced, but she did think it was weird that the closet was open when both her and I specifically remembered me closing it. The next experience is more recent. I had become curious with lucid dreaming and began to study how to go about it. I read somewhere that a way to induce a lucid dream is to lie completely still until you fall asleep, not moving a muscle. I also put this lucid dream inducing music that I found on YouTube and started to fall asleep. Now I have a big 100-pound German Shepherd that sleeps with me every night. He's my sidekick and my baby, and I love him more than anything. Shortly after I got into the twilight phase of falling asleep, I realized I was beginning to have sleep paralysis, which again isn't uncommon for me. It's usually more annoying to me than anything, and I rarely felt unsafe because of it. This was the first time getting it since I moved out on my own a couple of months prior. This felt different. I felt like the lucid dream music had turned sinister. My bed faces the door, and when I opened my eyes I could see a figure peering in from outside my doorframe. It looked like a demon to me. Not very human-like, more like something close to an evil humanoid dog. I felt its presence. I could feel that it wanted to come in, but couldn't pass the threshold. I started trying to say my dog's name to get myself out of the paralyzed state. Eventually I was able to, and my paralysis lifted. My dog picked up his sleeping head, concerned, and the creature vanished. To this day I feel like the only reason the creature couldn't or wouldn't come near me was because I was being protected by my dog. But I could be wrong. I don't know if these sleep paralysis kind of stories belong here, but they definitely felt paranormal to me. Oh, and this may be a stretch, but a part of me thinks whoever made the lucid dream music video on YouTube was trying to sabotage people by saying the song caused lucid dreaming. Really, I think it was supposed to cause something more sinister. I'm most likely just being paranoid though. I really hope I don't get sleep paralysis tonight. So this is something that happened to me about 7 years ago. I'm 18 now, so I was 11 when it happened, and I just want to say that this story includes self-harm, suicide, and possible murder. I was out on a late-night walk with my friend. We'll call her Daisy. We were on our way home from leaving a store that was walking distance from my house, so it only took us around 7 minutes to get back. I live in Texas, so the sun goes down around 5 p.m. It was 5:30 by the time we left, so the sun was just barely beaming light for us to see from the trees. I live in front of a football field and my school, so there were street lights but there was no sidewalk. We were walking through the school parking lot when we saw a man on the other side of the street, walking at the exact same pace as us. I was beaten up by my old friends, and at some points in my life also my mom as a kid, so I would always go straight to the worst scenario when I would come across strangers. My friend was slowly walking to the road, but when she walked to the road, so did the man. But he didn't cross, he just stood there. His back seemed to be hunched over, and his hands were in his pockets. I grabbed my friend's hand and whispered, "Keep walking." She listened and continued. When we walked a few miles up, we looked behind us and the man was still just standing there. There were no cars, so my friend and I crossed the street and booked it to the house. I wish I could now say that that was the last time we saw him, but no. A month passed and me and my friend were in my room playing. We were playing dolls until we heard a thud on my room wall. We were used to stray cats perching up on my windowsill for food, so I went to the corner of my room, filled a bowl with cat food and walked to the window. When I got close enough, what I saw was the shape of a human standing outside. I was able to see it clearly because the sun was beaming down on it. I screamed, dropped the cat food, took my friend's hand and ran out of the room. I told my mum what I had just seen, and all she did was yell at me and shoved me and my friend back into the room. We stayed in the far corner of the room, so if there was someone at the window, he couldn't see us. Eventually we looked out of the window, and thankfully there was nothing there. After that, I would always make sure I had some cat food outside in the morning, so I wouldn't have to open my window and do it right then and there. A year later, and I'd forgotten about the man. I had also finally gotten a phone that year, and me and Daisy still talked, but she never really came over anymore. One day she went silent for about a month or so I texted her once a day. One day at 14:22, I always go by military time, she texted me, "Hey, I was wondering if I could come over tomorrow at around 7? I know your parents won't be home." Immediately a red flag was set off. How did she know? I don't think I told her that. Yeah, sure, seems good," I texted back, a little hesitant. I was excited to have her come over though. The next day around 6:30 p.m. I called my friend's number and her mother picked up. "Hello?" "Yes, hi, is Daisy coming over?" "What?" "Daisy. She texted me yesterday saying she's coming over." There was a long pause before my heart sank. Daisy died a few months back. I froze and had to swallow some vomit that had come up in my throat. Then who texted me? "Call the police. And an old man broke into our house last night. Call them now." I panicked, hung up and called 911, just as I heard my front door open. I forgot that I'd kept it unlocked for her, so I locked my bedroom door and hid under my bed. Panting and crying into the phone, as I spoke to the lady on the other line, I could hear the man whistle a calm tune before I could then hear him wiggle the doorknob to my room. A few seconds later the door was on the floor, broken down from him kicking it in. I went silent. The man came in, crawling fucking backwards and laughing. I was about to cry, but I couldn't breathe. I saw his neck snap towards me, and he started to sprint, crawling towards me. I screamed and blacked out from a panic attack. I woke up to the police dragging me out from under my bed. I started to panic again and almost hit him, but he eventually calmed me down. They said that they had caught the guy licking my face, almost ready to tear it off. They led me outside and the man was staring at me through the window, waving and grinning. After this incident, I started cutting myself, because my mum would never agree to me being able to talk to someone about it. One night, after my mum had taken all of my blades away, I heard that thud again. I opened my curtains and he was on my windowsill, holding a blade. I looked up at his face and he was smiling and waving then from a few miles away. In elementary, around 4th or 5th grade, we had a classmate who claimed she had her third eye opened. Back around that time, a typhoon had come and flooded the city, so classes were suspended for a week or two. After the city had recovered, the classes were resumed. The classmate I mentioned earlier now claimed that the old classroom that no one uses anymore gave her a heavy feeling. We asked her why she felt this, and she said that when the school had been flooded, some kind of spirit had come with it. We would talk about it for days and days, until we finally had time after class hours to investigate. There were about 10 students still milling the corridors and a staff member that paid us no mind, so there was only my classmate and 2 others, one of which had a phone. They entered the old classroom. It was dark, and the only light source was what the window was letting in. I and some others that had followed stood at the door looking in. The one with the phone stood in one place near the window filming, while the other 2 were walking around. From where we could see from the door window, nothing was really going on, so we eventually got bored watching and sat down. Finally, the 3 investigating students came out of the old classroom. We immediately asked our classmate for her thoughts on what she was feeling, but all she did was stare ahead, not looking at any of us, then walked away. It was so odd. She liked ranting to us about anything and everything, so she would have normally told us about it. Unless, of course, she'd seen something really traumatic that the other 2 hadn't seen. She also easily gets scared and doesn't like scaring others, so she wasn't trying to scare us. Either way, she spooked us. We had even shaken her and tickled her in an attempt to get a reaction, but nothing. Even the school staff started to become concerned. Then the student that had the phone called out and ushered us in to watch the video that she had just filmed. It was dark, as this wasn't a time when phone cameras would film very well in the dark, so all we could see was darkness, save for the white blouse and polo of our school uniform, worn by the boy and the girl inside the room. We got to a part of the video where the boy was walking towards the camera, followed by our dear classmate with a third eye. But then we see that she was followed by another person. A person in addition to the 3 that were already in the room. This person was wearing a distinct uniform and was tailing my classmate with inhuman speed after she had passed through the camera frame. We kept replaying that part of the video. It really spooked us, even to the point that a lot of us started praying. Eventually the girl woke up from whatever kind of trance she was in and was confused that she was sitting outside instead of walking around inside. We told her about what had happened to her and how freaked out we were. If I remember correctly, she was oddly calm yet still confused. She then told us that there was a spirit of a dead student from another school inside that classroom. The spirit was a girl with messy hair that covered her face, and she wore a long skirt like ours, a long-sleeved white blouse and a long necktie. We were even more scared after hearing her description, because with it we could conclude that that was what we saw following her in the video. We showed her the part of the video clip of the apparition, but now it only showed the boy and her approaching the camera. Suddenly, no one was following her anymore. So my ex-best friend, let's call her Sally, has long, straight, dark brown hair all the way down to her bum, and she could never get it cut or dyed because her grandparents wouldn't let her. Her hair was what she was mainly known for, as it was so long. Sally and I were really close growing up. I met Sally in 3rd grade, and we were inseparable. About a year before I met her, her mum had passed away, and not a day went by where she didn't talk about her, even up until we were 15 years old. After a couple of years of hanging out with her, she started to get into some pretty scary shit at a young age. She started using Ouija boards and trying to summon spirits. In all honesty, when I say summon, she was probably just mumbling shit she didn't know, but whatever it was creepy, and she was only 11. She always told me that she had seen some paranormal stuff, and haunted shit would always happen around her house. I never believed her because I never really believed in that stuff anyway. My mum always told me it wasn't real, yada yada, but I'm a firm believer now after this encounter. So one night we were having a little sleepover party with this other girl, who I'll call Faith. We told scary stories and watched scary movies, did each other's makeup and just stuff like that. By the end of the night, Faith was getting tired and so was I, so we decided to turn in. Sally wanted to stay awake and play on her computer all night. So I told her good night and we went to bed. During the night I woke up, drenched in sweat, so I got up to see if Sally was still awake. She was sitting there on her chair with the computer off and she looked like she was laying down with her stomach on her legs, arms out by her sides, and her long hair just dangling out in front of her face onto the floor. She looked like she was sleeping in a weird position or something. I went to wake up Faith because I figured something was wrong with Sally. I looked over to where Faith is sleeping, and there is Sally, lying on the bed, sleeping. I looked up and nothing is on the chair anymore. I quickly try to wake Faith up, but she's not waking up. I'm really trying to shake her and she just mumbles, "Go back to bed." So I tried to wake up Sally, and she hates being woken up. So she got mad and said, "Just go back to bed, Jesus." And she went back to sleep. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, so I got up and went and watched TV in her living room until morning. I ended up sleeping on the couch, and they came out to wake me up around noon, asking why I was being a freak out last night. I told them everything, and Sally was the only one who ever believed me. I'll never forget this because this scared the living shit out of me, and I'll always still vividly remember her long brown hair dangling on the floor. Sally and I stopped being friends when we were 16 years old. I'm 23 now, and she died 2 years ago by stabbing herself in the stomach while she was 20 weeks pregnant. I really miss her a lot. This all happened in the UK during the mid-90s or so. I was about 8 years old and my family and I lived in a small coastal town where my dad had always owned a second-hand vinyl record shop. During this time, his shop was located on a street where half the street was shops and the other half was multi-story flats and apartments. My dad's shop was the last one in the row, so he had a shop to one side of him and the beginning of the multi-story apartments on the other. I would spend quite a lot of time at my dad's shop, mainly just playing around with my brother and sister, but quite early on we noticed this woman who would walk past the shop a lot. She was very short and always wore the same filthy floral dress, and in general seemed to have very bad hygiene. It became obvious from my dad, just making small talk with her, that she had quite a severe learning difficulty, and she had lived in one of the apartments right next to my dad's shop. She was always alone and didn't seem to be getting any outside help or care, even though she could have really used it. Fast forward a few years. One evening my dad got a phone call at home in the middle of the night, telling him that his shop had been broken into. He went down there as it's only a 10-minute walk from our house, and the police are there collecting evidence and interviewing the person who made the call to the police. It turned out that the call was from one of the neighbours from the multi-story apartments who had heard the alarms and glass breaking. Because it was so close, they thought someone was breaking into their own building. The neighbour informed the police about the vulnerable woman with the filthy floral dress, who lives in the apartment beneath her, and how she must have heard everything like they had also, and is probably terrified. So they knocked on her door to check on her, but there was no answer. It went on like this until they decided to break the door down. Once they were in, they were met with a pungent smell. They found the source of the smell pretty quickly. She was on the floor and had been dead for a few days. They checked the rest of her apartment, and it was when they got to the kitchen that they made a gruesome discovery. They found a child, a girl, and she had been placed in an old-fashioned metal high chair, the kind you put babies in to feed them. But she had been put in there as a young child, and now was at least 10 or 11, and she had never been taken out again. Her body was growing inside the chair, with the metal fusing right into her flesh as she grew around it, squashing her in. The worst pieces were the 2 bits of metal that had almost disappeared into her hips. The muscles on her leg were atrophied from never being used, and because she lived day and night in that high chair, there was feces and urine covering the bottom half of her body, and the floor surrounding her was further evidence to her being imprisoned her whole life into one spot. The hell that must have been for that child's life is unimaginable. She was still alive when they found her, and she panicked when she saw the police, as I'm guessing that she had never seen another person in her life, apart from her own mother, as whoever would witness a person in that condition would have reported it. She started to scream horrendously and made very primal noises, as I really don't think she could even talk. The police, out of sheer panic and instinct, wanted to free her and immediately tried to start removing the metal that was infused into her. It didn't last long though, as she died in a few minutes of what I assumed to be overwhelming shock from the whole situation. My dad didn't witness this firsthand himself, as he was outside standing on the street with forensics, but heard a lot of commotion happening and thought maybe the burglar was hidden in there or something. It wasn't until a few days later, when everything had calmed down slightly, that he spoke to the neighbour again to thank them for making the call when he heard the full story from them. They had seen it all. No one was aware of her having a child, and they had all thought she'd lived alone there. My dad didn't tell us the full story of this until we were a lot older, and when we were discussing it, we came to a few really sad realizations. Floral dress lady had such a low mental age that in all likelihood she was raped, which is how she had her child. She probably went through the entire pregnancy and birth with absolutely no assistance, and nobody noticed or cared, as she had a very round body shape all the time. The story was not even in the local newspapers. I know you're not supposed to taunt a spirit or anything like that, but I'm kind of dumb and have the fuck it attitude. Anyway, let's get into this story. One of my best friends that I've known since first grade, we're 22 now, lived not far from me, so I would always be at their house, sometimes sleeping there for days. There was a little group of us that consisted of my friend, her brother, our other friend, and me. This is important because I would use them to make sure I wasn't crazy when something would happen. It all started when one of my friend's little brothers had some of his friends over. One of his friends was into witchcraft or something, which I don't really believe in, but let's just say he had a weird vibe to him. Now this guy came over a few times and would bring weird things, including a Ouija board, but I thought nothing of it. Maybe they just wanted to have fun and a little scare, I don't know. It wasn't until the last night that he was there that things started to get weird. At first it was little things like the dog door opening and closing on its own at 3 a.m, and doors creaking open or closed. Little things you would just brush off and not worry about. Then things would start happening in the daytime that started to throw me off. Doors would sometimes slam shut while we were all in the living room, or cups would move on the countertops when we weren't looking. We would hear footsteps in the hallway and just look at each other with a face that would say, "What the fuck?" Me being the oldest male, both of my friends were girls, they would always send me to check things out. This is where I would get bold and brave, and this is where my boldness intensified things. After certain things would happen, I would yell out, "You're not scary enough and you wouldn't do it again because you're scared." Or things like, "Do it again right now, bitch." I wasn't really that scared because I always had the thought of God being with me, and as long as he's there, nothing can hurt me. So I would just taunt whatever it was without any real regard as to what it could actually be. It was one night that my friend, her cousin and I went into the garage to smoke because that's where our hangout spot was. As we were talking, I could hear whispering in the distance, so I told them to shut up so I could listen. To my surprise, I was the only one that could hear it. Needless to say, they were a little freaked out. Now here's the funny mad part. I turned to my friends and said, while making the quotations with my fingers, "If there is a demon here, then fuck 'em." And as soon as I quotationed the demon word, the light in the garage flickered on and off, which it had never done before. I did it again, and the same thing happened. The girls ran out the garage, leaving me by myself, just laughing. So much happened in this house that I can't write it all down, so I'll end it with this one. I was on the couch with one of the dogs, and my friend was on the recliner facing the TV. To give you a little layout so you can picture the scene, the couch I was on was facing the front yard where you can see out of the windows and can see the driveway. To the right was where the dining room table was, and there was a window that also looked out to the driveway and the wall of the next door house. Anyway, me and Buddy were chilling on the couch, and from my peripheral view I caught a dark figure, and by dark I mean you couldn't see through the thing at all. So I instinctively looked in its direction and watched the back of this figure as it walked by the window. At that same moment the dog had seen it too and started barking violently. I jumped up and ran to the windows that look out onto the driveway to see if anyone was going to run out, but nothing. My friend was asking me, "What the fuck is wrong?" And I ran out the front door to look in the driveway to see absolutely nothing. I even checked the recycling bin and trash cans to see if anyone had jumped in there to hide. After searching for a good 10 minutes, I found nothing and saw no one around, and it was broad daylight. This all started around the beginning of 2015. For context, my friend and I were living in Barracks with his room on the left, a kitchen in the middle, and my room on the right. Both doors could be closed, so the only thing that was open was the kitchen. I think the first paranormal occurrence that happened was a trash can lid falling off by itself, and both of us watching as it happened. We could both see it through our bedroom doors, as the trash can was in both of our eye lines. There was no way without help that it could have lifted itself off and slid onto the floor. Some weeks, maybe a month later, I was cleaning the kitchen when I came across something in a cabinet above the stove. It was a poster that had been torn up I don't know how many times, so I duct taped it back together. It was like this railway made of skulls leading to a major city that was on fire. We both thought it was strange, but we said fuck it and hung it above the stove. A little time after that, we found a dagger in the microwave. We asked everyone we knew if it was theirs, but it turned out it belonged to our friend Benji. He always kept it in his truck, but never remembered bringing it into the barracks, let alone our room. Anytime my friend and I would watch movies, the door would shake for no reason at all. There were no drafts and no negative pressure. It was so strange. Another time I'm taking a shower, which is located on my friend's side of the barracks. Getting out and walking to my room, he says, "Hey Rick, did you cough or say something just then?" I said no. Then he says he heard a voice from his closet that was raspy and abrupt say, "Hey." My friend was clearly freaked out by this, so I grabbed a blessed cross that I had in my room and hung it on a bedpost for a little peace of mind. Around the summer of 2015, on our hour-and-a-half lunch break, I would go back to the barracks room. I was reheating some pizza, and I turned towards the sink. Suddenly a wine glass flew off of the dish rack and broke at my feet. It cleared about 6 feet when it landed, so it didn't just fall. I called my friend immediately to tell him what had happened. Then I calmly cleaned up the glass, ate my lunch and left. Things were quiet for a little while, until one night I came back to the barracks drunk, and I stumbled into my room, carrying a bag of 40 McNuggets in it. The lights were off except for one in my bedroom and the one above the sink. I saw my friend in the TV's ambient light, walked over to the kitchen table and sat down, then asked, "Hey buddy, you want any of these McNuggets?" To which he replied, "No man, I'm gonna head to bed." We said goodnight and I went into my room. The next morning around 6 a.m. I walked over to my friend's room to wake him up, and he wasn't there. So I called him to find out if he went to Waffle House early with our other friend Tom. He answered and told me he'd not even come home last night. Now I know I was drunk, but I wasn't imagining people who weren't there. Now that one time of seeing him and talking to him really made me feel like I was crazy. Quick side note, Tom was one of our good friends and he was always there on weekends. Fast forward to another time. I'm in my friend's room and we're about to watch a movie. From the bathroom you could see into my bedroom and I hear the door open. He says, "All right, bucko, you ready to watch this?" whilst walking towards my doorway. I say yeah, and he walked into his room a little shaken and says, "I just saw you in your room." Already being freaked out and deciding to have a drink, we watched The Conjuring. We could see shadows moving under the door, and the door started shaking on its own. The last thing I want to mention, besides angels in the diner, was about 2 days before my friend left Bragg for California. He was sitting in his room packing his bags, and I went from my room to his to bullshit with him a little bit. When I came back to my room, my desk chair was spinning on its own very slowly. It made 5 to 6 revolutions at a snail's pace. I walked back to his room and dragged him over to the door and said, "See the shit you're leaving me with?" That was summer 2017. We both got out of the army within 2 weeks of each other. I moved back to Cleveland and he moved back to California. Every Thanksgiving he comes out to visit me in the house I bought when I moved back. I'm damn sure it's haunted, but that's for a different story. So this year he brought his girlfriend out to meet me. When they got there, I told them about the house and what I think about it, and his girlfriend says, "Well, I don't feel anything here." "Oh, okay, no worries." I told them about using the bathroom upstairs and about how you can hear a woman's voice saying, "Hi." I thought it was my fiancé at the time, so I answered back, washed my hands, went downstairs and had the realization that I was the only one there. So as the night wears on, we're talking in my kitchen, when a plant suddenly falls off of the windowsill, startling us. Now she's freaked out because there were no drafts, and I'm shocked the House of Horrors is participating. So she started walking around outside, and the light on my garage is dimming and going on and off. Now we're really setting the tone. She comes back inside, and we're all walking around, just looking for things out of place, I guess. When we stepped onto my front porch, we could hear a woman's voice very clearly say, "Hi." It was the same voice I heard in the bathroom. It's now around 2:30 in the morning, and nobody's out, and definitely not that chipper. She then starts crying, hurries inside, closes all the doors and windows and salts them. That was the last paranormal thing that happened to us, and that was Thanksgiving 2018. I've always been a big fan of ghost stories and spooky things, but I've never had a story happen directly to me. I've always wanted or been excited to experience these things. I've just never had an incident that has made me fully commit to saying that I've had a ghost experience. However, I usually ask people that I'm comfortable with whether they have any ghost stories. Most of the time I hear some pretty great tales. I have a lot from family and some crazy ones from my girlfriend, who I think is like the boy from The Sixth Sense. I'm generally a skeptic, but have fun listening to spooky stories nonetheless. Last night when I was at work, I asked my boss if he had any ghost stories. He said he did, so he told me the story whilst cleaning up the bar that he owns. I can only take it as truth, as he admitted to me that he's still somewhat skeptical about it all. But the more he thinks about it, the more he thinks it was more of a ghost encounter than a strange occurrence. This is the story that he retold to me, and we both admitted to getting goosebumps. My boss, Tom, was living in the UK and was moving out to Sydney, Australia, to work on a big project that required long around-the-clock hours. This included working primarily in front of his laptop. Tom's wife's stepsister owned a house here in Sydney that was located in a rather old-timey area near the ports and docks. The stepsister was going away for a while and offered her townhouse for Tom to stay in whilst he was working on this crazy busy project. So he flew out and stayed there by himself. The main bedroom was located on the top floor of the house. At the far end of the room there was a slant in the roof that only gave a small amount of distance between the floor and the roof, so the designers made a built-in wardrobe to make use of the awkward space. The bed was situated near the doors of these wardrobes, though I don't know how far. One night while Tom was sleeping, he was woken up by the sound of deep sobbing. It woke him in a panic, and he was thinking that it was possibly a fox, as they roughly make the sound of a crying baby at times. The tone was kind of low, and it made him think it was a man. He also noticed that the cries were coming from the wardrobe area, which also backed onto the wall that was shared with the neighbours. Not thinking much about it, he thought it may be the neighbours, and so tried to get to sleep again. This happened again the next night, and the night after that. Eventually, on the third night, Tom was awoken by this sobbing sound again, and was starting to become more suspicious of it. He sat up in bed and was looking at the wardrobe doors in the dark. He heard the cries for a moment until one of the wardrobe doors popped open. Right at that moment, he sat up in bed. Tom jumped out of bed at this sight and raised his fist in the air, getting ready to punch or defend himself at whatever came out of the wardrobe. But nothing appeared. He stood there for a moment, then grabbed his bag and hurried downstairs. Sitting in the lounge room downstairs, he got his things and prepared for the day. He decided to stay at a friend's house for the remaining days he had in Australia, because he was too spooked to go and sleep another night in that house. Trying to rationalise it, Tom thought maybe the things in the wardrobe were pushed up against the door and it popped open. The more he thinks about it, the more he thinks how strange it was. He never spoke to his stepsister about it, out of embarrassment, I guess. Years later they were at a family function, and he was talking to her about the time he had stayed there, and asked her about the neighbours, and who lived next door. His stepsister said to him that the next door house had been empty since she bought the place. I have strong reason to believe that Tom was telling the truth. On June the 3rd, that morning, I had gotten home from work and did the things that I would normally do. I had washed down an Ambien with a beer as normal, and then I laid down for bed. Had I no sooner closed my eyes when I received a phone call. Knowing that only a few people had my number, and even fewer of them were set to ring, even if my phone is on silent, I promptly answered it and went on to receive the worst news of my life. My mother had had some type of heart issue and had collapsed. I managed to make the 40-mile trip in around 20 minutes, with a stop for gas in the middle. The next few days were a whirlwind in which I didn't sleep and barely ate while I waited for my verbally and psychologically abusive mother to die. We took her off of life support, and I spent the next 13 hours holding her hand. After the funeral, I found myself sitting at home. I was playing a video game when I began to feel as though someone was pissed and really eye-fucking me from the doorway to the kitchen. An interesting note was that my mother was always sitting in her kitchen since she was always sewing. As the time passed, the feeling of being stink-eyed intensified until it was starting to make me shake. The dog came down from her spot upstairs, then walked halfway out to the kitchen before turning around and going back. That was when I began to think that I may have fallen asleep and someone had somehow snuck around me. Being a self-defense kind of a person, I called out, but nobody answered. I did the same thing upstairs with the same result. I returned to my chair and brought up a friend's contact in my phone. At this point I was beginning to think that I was suffering from some kind of mental episode and needed to go to the hospital before reality totally broke. I began packing an overnight bag when it occurred to me that I have always been a bit weird. I made the decision to be really weird for the length of time it took to smoke a cigarette. If the paranoia and fear got worse or stayed the same, then I would make my phone call. I lit the cigarette and walked halfway out to the kitchen and took a deep breath. I'm so very glad that you came. You're welcome any time that you would like to come. However, if this is how you're going to make me feel, then you are no longer welcome. You will have no... Thus I continued with a fairly standard license to depart that is commonly used at the end of spirit work. After this I sat down in my chair and finished my smoke. By the time I was done, the fear, heaviness and paranoia had left totally. I spent a few minutes crying and then left a bit of wine out.